Okay, so my original work ended up being really, really long because I found a lot of information on it, and I started to get super deep in information because I got into the subject a lot. So I'll just kind of skim over like the main points of my presentation. So I did it over drone planes and targeted killings, a little bit about the history. Drone planes have been being used for a really long time. Obviously, sometimes a bit more of like a crude version. But ever since 2001, after 9/11, drone planes have been making drastic improvements as the need for foreign defense became a more important issue. So a little bit about them. They're controlled remotely, which is the biggest part about them that makes them different from other things. A lot of them are controlled from the Creech Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, and they're being flown over areas like Pakistan and Afghanistan. So that's really impressive technology that, they're being flown from a completely different place, so thousands of miles away across an ocean. So there's a pilot and operator and someone to communicate with ground forces if it's working with ground forces. So there's different kinds, but mostly I looked at the strategic size, which is like the large size. So the Predator and the Reaper are the two main drone planes that are being used. The Reaper is the more advanced one. It's faster and carries more firepower. It's more expensive. So they carry all different sorts of missiles. Will that play? Nope. Okay. And they have different surveillance tools to give the best image of what they're looking at if they're just doing surveillance. So they have black and white cameras, image intensifiers, radar, infrared imaging, and lasers, as well as all their weapons. So they're really good for both surveillance and for like using weaponry. So the major pros and cons of using drone planes. A pro is that it can be flown longer than a manned aircraft, and it's cheaper because it's carrying like less weight and less fuel. And there's no danger to an aircraft crew or ground troops, which is probably the biggest pro of drone planes in general, is it puts no American lives at risk, which is what people find the most important about them. But cons include civilian casualties, the ethics of extrajudicial killing, which is killing without due process of legal jurisdiction, and putting strains on foreign relations. A lot of times it's difficult to get an accurate picture of what's going on in the area when you're only looking through the drone plane camera. And the accuracy isn't 100%, so a lot of times there's collateral damage, including civilians or buildings nearby, or shrapnel flying. One of the major weapons has like a 600-foot shrapnel radius, so anyone kind of in the vicinity has a chance of being killed or injured. And it really frightens a lot of people overseas. They feel like they're being targeted. So under the Obama administration, drone strikes have increased, despite Obama saying that he doesn't support drone strikes. And the major issue with targeted killings is the anti-Americanism that it breeds overseas. A lot of people have had friends or family killed by drone strikes, and it makes them feel like that they're being targeted. They don't understand that Americans are targeting terrorists, and terrorists spread propaganda around the countries that tells civilians that they're being targeted by America, and America hates them, America wants them dead. So that makes foreign policy really, really tough, and makes peacemaking with the people of foreign countries really, really tough when they feel as though they're being targeted. America's response to drone planes are pretty positive. Most Americans don't really think about the effects it can have in a foreign country, and just like the fact that it keeps American lives out of danger, which is important, but thinking about the big picture is also important. A lot of Americans feel positively towards drones, although it kind of creates a feeling of like suspense, almost creepiness, that they could be spied on by drones, they don't even see it. So it's kind of a tricky subject. So just a couple high-profile killings by drone strikes. In 2011, Anwar al-Awlaki was killed. He was a U.S. citizen, but he was thought to be conspiring with terrorist groups. And he was killed by a drone strike. It was the first U.S. citizen to be targeted by a drone strike. It's really controversial because he was executed without trial by jury or without being able to go to court, which is kind of against the Constitution. So that was a really big deal, and a lot of Americans thought that it was excusable because he was considered to be a terrorist, but a lot of Americans also felt that he deserved to go have due process of law, as all Americans are guaranteed. And later that year, his son was targeted and killed, even though it had no connection to terrorism. The CIA states that they were targeting someone else, but the person that they were targeting wasn't present. So again, the controversy kind of just continues to get more and more like a large scale as drone strikes are pretty secretive, and it's not really well known to most Americans what's going on and what the CIA is planning. And also, drone planes were used in the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011, which most people are very familiar with. And Pakistan called it an act of war because the U.S. didn't tell them what they were planning or what was going on. So using the drone planes in this was also very controversial because the foreign nation didn't agree with what was going on. So after I researched the uses and pros and cons of drone planes, I started to look at the legality of it and if it was legal under international or domestic law. So the government says that since like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia are the main countries that are being targeted, the U.S. believes that their governments aren't equipped to handle terrorism, so that they feel the need to step in and protect like all democracy from these countries. And here's some maps. Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then Yemen and Somalia are kind of the main countries where drone strikes are becoming a problem, but other countries are used with them as well. And then the federal administered tribal area in in Pakistan, is a really popular place for drone strikes. It's kind of like the tribal area. It's known as like lawless, and the Pakistani government has a really tough time keeping control of that area. That's where a lot of terrorists are known to be. So that kind of like northwest region is a really, really like hot spot for drone strikes and for terrorist activities. So domestically, the justification for targeted killings is the 2001 authorization for use of military force, which empowers the president to use all necessary and appropriate force in pursuit of those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. However, this is a bit out of date because it does refer to the 9/11 attacks, and so killing people that aren't directly involved with that kind of goes against that, even though it's used for most attacks. Under the UN Charter, you're allowed to provide self-defense if militants are plotting against the U.S. or their own government, which again is kind of tricky to define that when no one really knows what's going on, especially in the tribal areas. And then internationally, it continues to be a bit difficult to define. You're allowed to provide self-defense if it's against combatants, but it's kind of, again, difficult to define who's a combatant when the U.S. has a tendency to classify all military-age males as a threat. So it's kind of hard to find proof and to find like the justification for a targeted killing when you're not there, and when the drone plane doesn't provide an accurate picture of everything that's going on and exactly what's in the surrounding area. So the current protocol for drone strikes, the Obama administration uses a disposition matrix to decide who will be targeted and who won't. And it's not public, but The Atlantic kind of speculates on what it looks like. It's kind of something like this. It kind of goes, can they be arrested? Are they an immediate danger? If so, then they should be targeted, and if not, then they should, be given some time to think about another course of action. But this doesn't really seem to always be the case because of the fact that drone strikes have been increasing drastically in the last 8 years. So, my proposed protocol to solve the problem is to get rid of the 2001 AUMF because I think it's out of date, and to require warrants for most targeted strikes unless the target's extremely time sensitive. But in most cases, I think that more research should be present, and there should be like a chain of command when deciding on these on whether to strike or not. And also to report strikes to the Security Council, which is already supposed to be a thing, but the U.S. kind of tends to skip over that sometimes. Also, I think that before striking an area, the U.S. should attempt to gain agreement from that country where they'll be striking, just to prevent foreign relations from further deteriorating. Also, to accurately report civilian casualties, because the U.S. kind of again has a tendency to keep things not as transparent as they could be, and cook the books a little bit when it comes to numbers of civilian casualties. So I think that's important. And to avoid signature strikes, which is where you just strike an area where it's assumed that terrorists are meant to be, but just to focus airstrikes on known leaders and high-ranking operators, and to know exactly who you're striking before sending out the missile. So for my final product, I have been working with my mentor and learning more about the CCA lab, which is what she runs at circuit card assembly. And specifically to look at the cleaning chemistry used in the circuit cards. Raytheon recently tackled this problem, and they just came up with a new cleaning chemistry. So by me being able to look at the same problem was a good, realistic, real-world experience because it was a problem that the company just faced. So this is good, hands-on, practical experience for me. Okay, so the problem that I was given is all residues must be removed from CCAs to ensure no corrosion. The cleaning chemistry selected must get under extremely low profile components, a 2 mil gap, to remove residues and also rinse out effectively. So that was the prompt that I was given by my mentor in order to solve. So the goal of this is to get rid of the flux that are left over on CCAs after they've been completed. So when a circuit card is being manufactured, the parts are soldered onto the copper circuit board, but as soon as the copper touches the air, it starts to oxidize, which creates an ineffective solder joint, makes it kind of easy to be compromised, so it's not as strong. So in order to get rid of the oxidation, they use flux, which reacts with the copper oxide to get rid of it and creates a clean surface for the flux or for the solder to react with, and so it creates a super sturdy joint. Make sure the part won't fall off, nothing bad will happen, make sure the board is going to always be up to par and always going to be safe for whoever is using it. After the board is completed and the part is on there and the solder joints are good, there's leftover flux residues, but those can't be left on because it leaves behind an acid, and so that acid can start to corrode parts and make it short circuit. As well as it's like an ionic acid, so it leaves a trail that metal ions can use to migrate. That's electromigration, and it forms the dendrites, which is what that picture is. So that's really, really bad. That can't happen. If that happens, it kind of compromises the effectiveness of the board and how well it's going to work, and causes it to short circuit. So that has to be avoided. That's another reason flux has to be removed. And after the board is completed, there's an environmental protection coating put on it to protect it from the sun or wind or rain or anything like that. And if the flux is on the board, it kind of prevents that from going on as smoothly and cleanly as possible. So getting the flux off is really, really important. There can hardly be any left, just to make sure that no parts will be hurt by it. So in order to remove the flux, the parts are really close to the board. It's a 2 mil gap, which is 2/1000 of an inch, and the flux is under that. So water can't get under there because the surface tension is too high. So there has to be some sort of aqueous chemical that can get under that gap and rinse out the flux from underneath. So the requirements of a cleaning chemistry: it must have a low surface tension, it must be able to resolve the flux and fingerprint oils on the board, it has to be environmentally safe, it has to be safe for people in the workplace to handle. It should be able to be recycled, so it can be used multiple times by the company or to be cost effective. It needs to be compatible with the inline cleaner, which is what Raytheon uses to clean the boards. So this is the inline cleaner. The board starts at one end and it kind of makes its way through. So after it's completed, it'll go in there and it's washed with water, and then it's washed with the cleaner and the water, and then rinse one more time, and then in a dryer. So that whole process takes about 10 minutes for the whole board to go through there. So the flux that's used on the board is RMA flux. It's rosin. So it has an organic acid in it, which is abitic acid. It's like a rosin from trees. It has a solvent, which is isopropyl alcohol, and an activator, which I assume to be diethylamine hydrochloride, that's the activator is a catalyst between the reaction between the abitic acid, which is the rosin acid, and the copper oxide on the board. And then the activator will dissociate and turn into the hydrochloride, which is an acid that needs to be removed. So on this picture, all the kind of silvery branch looking part, which I click. Oh, all of this part is the oxide on the board that forms when it touches the air, which prevents the solder from sticking good. So this is the reaction that abitic acid reacts with the copper oxide to get rid of it, and the activator catalyzes this. So this is what goes on when the flux is first originally put on the board and what creates a good solder joint. So I started looking at cleaning chemistries and what would work and what wouldn't. So I came up with just, these are the ones I thought would be the best. All of them have a pretty low surface tension, but for one reason or another, a lot of them won't work. For example, the chloroethane is good for everything except for it's a gas, which doesn't really make much sense when it's supposed to be like an aqueous cleaner combined with water. And then hydrofluoroether is good, and it has the ability to separate into phases, which makes it easy to recycle, which is a big plus. And then I also looked at trichloroethane and isopropyl alcohol, which needs a lot of agitation to remove the flux residue, which we don't really have an inline cleaner, so that's not really a practical choice. So I decided to go with hydrofluoroether as the cleaning chemistry. It's a man-made compound, it's an organic solvent, it's really good at removing light oils and flux residues, and it was created to replace environmentally harmful substances, so it's good for the environment, and it's safe to use for people, and it can be combined with other solvents in order to become more aggressive, so you can kind of use it on a spectrum to make sure that everything is being removed from the board. It has a low toxicity, it's defined as zero ozone depletion potential by the EPA. It has a low global warming potential, so it is super safe for the environment. It's also safe for people to handle. It's not a volatile organic compound as defined by the EPA. It's not considered harmful. It's considered practically non-toxic. So in terms of being used in the workplace, it's a good choice because there's not much potential for dangerous reactions or occurrences or spills to happen. Another positive part of hydrofluoroether is that it will separate into phases as seen in the picture. So on the left, the straw-colored container is the used hydrofluoroether that has like the contaminants in it, and on the right, it's with the water and the used part with contaminants. So having that is easy because you can start to separate that and then filter out the contaminants from the hydrofluoroether and then use it again in the machine, which is really good. It's super cost effective to be able to do things this way instead of having to get rid of the liquid every single time you use it on a board. I need to get some information from my mentor on this one, but so it's sold by a company called Novec, which is a company that created it in 55-gallon, 30-gallon, or 5-gallon drums, which is good because Raytheon will be using a lot of it. And they have a fluid return program which will pick up the used containers and fluid and dispose of it, so it's not like Raytheon's problem to make sure that it's being disposed of properly. So that's another positive. So that was my final product, and I really enjoyed it because it was a good example of what a chemical engineer would be doing in the in the real field and in the workplace. And I really enjoyed learning about the cleaning chemistry. The first time I learned about it at a mentor visit, it was super interesting to me, and it was something that I really pay attention to because it has to do with the specific molecular compounds and how certain compounds work because of their structure, which is what I like best about chemistry. So I was glad that I got to do something with that. So going forward, I'll be attending California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo in the fall, and I'll be studying materials engineering, which is exciting for me because materials is kind of like a subset of chemical engineering, but it has a lot to do with how the structure of a molecule relates to its performance, which is what I like best. So looking at how metals and polymers and ceramics will perform the way they need to perform in certain scenarios. So I'm really excited to go there in the fall and start learning about that. And I'm really excited to go to college and meet professors and start looking for jobs and start looking for internships and be able to use all the things I learned in ISM, like good interview skills and how to dress professionally and my good handshake and all those things. I think I'm kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to that. So I'm really excited to go to college and be able to start putting that kind of stuff into practice. Also, as a result of ISM, I have a lot more confidence in professional settings and when I'm talking to adults. So I think that'll be really good for me to continue to work on that as I speak with professors and potential job bosses and things like that. So that's really good. I hope to have a lot of opportunities in the future in terms of working with my professors on their projects and having internships. So I definitely have an interest in the defense industry as a result of my mentorship, and I really hope that I can continue to work in that field and have internships in that field and continue to learn about that because it's something that I really like. So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, especially to my mentor again, Mrs. Hefner. She's been a huge help this whole semester and I've learned so much. Thank you all for coming.